everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. As Nomi just said, my name is Lexi Holden, and I'm an Emerson National Hunger Fellow, currently serving in the Food Research and Action Center's SNAP unit. It is my absolute pleasure to be emceeing or facilitating today's webinar, again titled New Hope Center Data on Food Insecurity Among College Students. Today's special guest and the presenter for this webinar is Carrie Welton. Carrie Welton is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice. Her career has focused on using evidence and research to improve federal and state policies that reduce the basic needs insecurity of people with low incomes, including students of color, parenting, first generation, and immigrant students. Her efforts and perspective have been greatly informed by her own experiences as a low-income first-generation college graduate. Carrie will present the Hope Center's latest findings for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll be opening it up and reading some questions from the Q&A. So be sure to throw those in there either throughout the presentation as you come up with them, or at the end. I'll give you a few seconds of time to get your thoughts together. We're super excited to have Carrie here, and I'm so looking forward to having a conversation with her at the end. So, Carrie, if you will take it away and share your data with us. Thank you so much again for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lexi, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Next slide, please. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to talk to you and do a very small preview of the Hope Center's most recent data on student basic needs and security. For those of you who are not aware, the Hope Center conducts the largest national survey of student basic needs security, and we just reached our 6th year. Our survey was in the field in fall of 2020. It was completed by nearly 200,000 students across 42 states at 130 two-year colleges and 72 four-year colleges and universities, as well as 14 HBCUs. Next slide, please. So when we talk about student basic needs and security, I think it's important to set some context for that. And this is what we call the new economics of college. This is what Dr. Sarah Golder-Grab has called the new economics of college. And what we have seen over time is that the burden of covering the cost of higher education has increasingly shifted to families and students. This has been due in part to federal and state disinvestment in higher education. Particularly during the Great Recession, we saw pretty significant cuts to higher education. And what we've also seen over the last couple of decades is increasing inequality, both wealth and income inequality that disproportionately affects people of color in this country, and a social safety net over the same time that has continued to be less and less effective as it was intended to be. So we find that most students are now working in college and often working in jobs that do not provide livable wages, which affect both their health and well-being, and we know directly impact their ability to persist and complete a post-secondary credential. And when the Hope Center says a post-secondary credential, a college degree, we sort of mean broadly any education beyond high school, including credentials, apprenticeships, certificate programs, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, all of the things we consider sort of post-secondary degrees and credentials. Next slide, please. What the survey found was that the pandemic had an obvious significant impact on college students. We found that 41% of students had a close friend or family member who were sick with COVID, and 7% were sick themselves. We also found that 13% of students overall lost a loved one to COVID, and Latinx students were more than twice as likely as white students to lose a loved one. Next slide, please. And we also found that nearly 3 in 5 students experienced basic needs insecurity during the pandemic. Basic needs insecurity, as you can see on the slide, we broadly define as food insecurity, housing insecurity, and homelessness. And we found that 39% of students at two-year institutions experienced food insecurity, while 29% at four-year institutions experienced food insecurity. We found the rates of housing and homelessness incidences among college students a little bit, there were more similar among 2- and 4-year students. As you can see, housing insecurity affected about 48% of students in our sample, and homelessness affected about 14% of students. And while we don't know all of the causes of this, we can speculate that students who lost housing either on campus or near campus, that they were there for to to complete their studies likely contributed to some of this housing and homeless effect. Next slide, please. Thank you. And we also see significant disparities in basic needs insecurity among certain groups. I think it's important anytime we're talking about disparities among groups that we set some context for this, because we know that in this country that individual and systemic racism have significantly harmed the ability of families of color to both accrue wealth and then pass on that wealth to their children and support their post-secondary completion. So these compounding factors are why we see some basic needs insecurity gaps among students of color. I think as advocates and researchers, it's important that we always set this context and not leave it to conjecture about why we have disproportionate outcomes for certain students. For example, the Federal Housing Act explicitly provided loans to white families while denying loans to Black families. And this gap in home ownership and the wealth that families have due to home ownership is actually cited as one of the largest contributors to the racial wealth gap. So when we look at the Black-white basic needs insecurity gap, we found that it was 16 percentage points. And then among parenting and non-parenting students, that gap was 15 percentage points. And then when we look at students across 2- and 4-year institutions, we saw that the basic needs insecurity gap overall was about 8 percentage points. Next slide, please. Thank you. So for many of you that have been doing this work for a while, we know that the investment from the CARES Act in emergency aid for students was a landmark investment, not just in emergency aid for students, which is the first federal indication that we've seen of the importance of emergency aid for students, but also when we think about the case that makes for cash transfers themselves for people with low incomes, and how the flexibility to use cash to address your own financial needs and to trust people to know what they need to do to address their financial and economic needs is so critical. And among students who received emergency aid, and in this case, this was both an analysis of CARES Act funding, which the emergency aid, the higher education portion of that we refer to as Higher Education Emergency Relief Funds 1. The subsequent legislation we refer to as the acronym HERF 2 and 3. So what we saw was for the students in our sample among that received emergency aid, it reduced the stress for students. 76% of students experienced reduced stress. And we found that it helped 73% afford educational materials and helped a whopping 70% of students stay enrolled. We also have some additional evidence that we can send about an early evaluation from Compton College about post-secondary completion related to emergency aid. And I'm happy to circulate that as a resource after this webinar if anyone is interested. Next slide, please. So what we found was among students that were facing basic needs insecurity, their access to additional supports is actually pretty severely limited. 34% applied for emergency aid in the fall. And I did mean to mention on that last slide that we were looking at both CARES Act emergency aid as well as non-CARES Act emergency aid. So this would have been institutions that had existing emergency aid programs in place before federal funding. So we did an assessment of both. And we found that among those that applied, 32% received emergency aid, while 18% of students in our sample were receiving SNAP at the time that they took the survey. Fully 52% of students did not apply for supports because they don't know how. And if you look into the survey a little bit more, some don't know they exist, some don't think that they're eligible, and the awareness and ability to access these programs that can reduce basic needs insecurity, we see as a continued problem. We can certainly talk about problems with eligibility and administrative burden, but the awareness piece of it we're finding is an increasingly large problem, particularly among students. Next slide, please. So this is why the Hope Center focuses on policy and advocacy. We know that education beyond high school is essential for our economic recovery and essential at reducing equity gaps. And our nation's current higher education and safety net systems do not address the new economics of college because they weren't built with today's students in mind. So many of the programs and policies that we see in place are decades old and reflect the traditional perspective of students as what we think of as a recent high school graduate that's going to attend a four-year institution and doesn't work or only works a little bit and still receives financial support for their parents. And we know that this category of students are the minority nowadays. So what we think of as non-traditional students are the overwhelming majority of college attendees today, but we still have structures and systems in place that are designed for this traditional student in mind. It's creating significant barriers. This is why we advocate for both a modernized safety net and a reimagined higher education that better supports student success. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read through all of these. You're welcome to access the slides after the presentation. Lexi and Nomi are welcome to send those out. Really quickly, I'll just say that what we advocate for in the student basic needs space is an improved safety net. We know that not only does our country do a phenomenal job of shaming people for being poor, which both increases stigma and reduces the willingness and ability of people to access safety net programs. But public programs that provide basic need supports like SNAP and cash assistance through the TANF program, as well as childcare subsidies, are rife with restrictions specifically on students. In fact, being a student itself has additional restrictions in it. And this is so counterintuitive given that we know post-secondary education is one of the best pathways to economic mobility. So we advocate for improvements to safety net programs, expanded national school lunch program, as well as additional supports that are specifically targeted at students, but also broader national policies that we know will improve overall economic well-being. Next slide, please. And in terms of higher education, the reimagining part is really thinking about federal and state partnerships that better support students, including a higher education funding model that prioritizes institutions that are serving students who have been the most marginalized and minoritized, and making permanent federal emergency aid for students. We're thrilled to see this window of opportunity at the federal level for some of this policy change and think we're just ripe for getting some things done that us advocates have been hoping for years. So with that, I will conclude my slides and kick it over to Lexi for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And actually, Nomi, if you could advance it one more slide, we have two QR codes here. So the first one, if you pull out your phone camera and just hold it up to the QR code, the first one will take you to the Hope Center's most recent report. And then the second one will link you to a FRAC chat on college hunger, which talks both about the report and just some more general things around college hunger and the new temporary revisions to SNAP that allow more college students to access it than before. So thank you so much, Carrie, for your fantastic presentation. College hunger is an issue that, as you said, so often goes unnoticed or under-discussed, and I am truly thankful to the Hope Center for its continued dedication to reporting on and researching this issue so that advocates and allies have the tools that they need to continue to do good work for college students facing basic needs insecurity. So thank you. We will be sending out these slides at the conclusion of the presentation. So you'll have a link to the report and all of the other resources that we've mentioned here today. So again, as I said, if you have any questions, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A portion. We are really excited to see them, and I'm excited to read them aloud. But in the meantime, I do have a couple of questions I prepared myself for Carrie. So how can we as anti-hunger advocates and allies, which I believe most of us here on the presentation are, help continue this conversation around college student basic needs and security into the next school year and beyond, even if the pandemic technically ends before students return to classes in the fall? What can we do to support your efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thanks for flagging that, Lexi, because we know that even once we are able to return to normal a little bit in terms of our social interaction, that this pandemic is going to have lasting effects on many communities, including students. What I would say is the opportunity now and both going into the fall is to advocate at the institutional level for how they're using their federal dollars regarding the higher education emergency relief funds. Particularly this most recent round, which we refer to as HERF3, has new flexibilities for institutions and the way that they're able to both increase their institutional capacity and also support students. And what we continue to find is that the effective design and distribution of emergency aid, particularly when we're looking through an equity lens, continues to be a problem. And that's only going to be exacerbated as institutions continue to get an additional tranche of funding. So I think the opportunity right now is for advocacy at the institution level to both support students as well as institutional leaders to figure out what is really needed and how we can support the targeted allocation of those resources that will impact students the most.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And because I am a bit of a data nerd, I wanted to know, when the Hope Center was conducting their research, of course, how did the pandemic also affect the data collection? I know that you probably distributed the surveys electronically, but still, how did that affect your survey population you were able to reach out to, given that many students were probably unable to continue with classes and had to no longer be students because of the effects of the pandemics on themselves and their families? If you could speak a little bit to the challenges around that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it, Lexi. So we actually think that our data grossly underrepresents basic need and security among students, because the survey is distributed by the institutions to their student population, and they are asked to complete it electronically. And if we think about the students we care about the most and the challenges that they're facing, the likelihood that they have the time and bandwidth to complete what is a fairly substantive survey is challenging to think that we're capturing all the students that are facing some of the most severe challenges. So this doesn't apply just to the pandemic. I think it's been exacerbated by the pandemic, but we believe our survey data understates basic needs and security across all of our surveys for the same reasons. I know, at least when I was a low-income single mom attending college, like completing a survey would have been the last thing I cared about. So that's anecdote, but we think that there's significant data from students that we are missing just due to the extreme challenges that they're facing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and for being able to recognize that. And I hope that people will be able to see that in the data, that even though these numbers are shocking and horrifying, that that's probably so much worse than what we think it is, just because it's so much more challenging to access participants in the survey. There's a question in the chat from Patricia Baker regarding federal work study and students being awarded federal work study but not being able to work it, so they can't get their work hours, which would normally disqualify them from SNAP. And I've talked a little bit about this in my blog post with the new temporary rule changes to SNAP, but would you be able to talk about how we have this win now? It's so exciting that students just have to qualify for federal work study at this time.
That's a great question. And hi, Pat, we're old friends. Glad you could make it. And I think that is actually a great question. And, Pat would probably agree, but the way that federal work study is structured is that institutions have the ability to identify, or at least set the criteria. They have some flexibility to set the criteria of what it means to meet financial need for federal work study. So that presents both an opportunity for institutions to identify a larger set of students that could meet that SNAP exemption. And for this group, I will just reiterate that the SNAP exemption that we're referring to is the change in recent stimulus package that expands SNAP eligibility to two categories of students. It expands SNAP eligibility to students with an expected family contribution of 0 for the academic year. And it also expands it to students who are eligible for work study, which is a departure from the current participates in work study. So we think there's opportunity for institutions to identify a broader set of students that could meet that eligibility for federal work study, and really reiterate both for students and for institutions that a student does not need to be assigned to a work study position or be participating in a work study position to meet this exemption criteria for SNAP. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but this one gets a little bit wonky and might be a good follow-up for this group.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And we can do some follow-up on that as well. And let's see, what else? Okay, just going through my questions that I had written up for myself to ask. So, of course, the Hope Center focuses on post-secondary students, but it's also very known that particularly for new or incoming faculty and staff, that there's also high rates of basic needs insecurity among them as well. So how could maybe understanding how these things affect students also help university administrators sort of change the way that they do things so that it also benefits those faculty and staff? How do we meet that need as well? Since of course we know students are facing these issues and faculty and staff are facing these issues as well. How can we sort of marry those two things together to find a solution?
Yeah. And so, Lexi, I think I understand the question is, given the extreme need, how are we translating the need to institutional and systems change that benefit both students and faculty where they're facing some of these similar challenges? So taking the Real College Survey data, every institution that participates in the instrument gets their own, the report of their data for their institution. And talking to them about what they can do with that data and information is something that the Hope Center has an entire separate team for. Our institutional transformation team works with institutions on culture, policy, and practice that help improve student success and overall a culture of care and centering sort of students as humans first and the things that we really care about. I would say that the ability to do this right now is both incredibly important and also incredibly challenging given the challenges higher education institutions are facing. And what the institutions are facing is in the context of already being under-resourced prior to the pandemic. So the new federal funds are amazing, but this is almost a, I don't know what the term is, but this is almost like a very large gift that's actually creating problems because not only do they have to be thoughtful about how they're spending this money in terms of the reporting requirements and things like that, but the Department of Education issued what we believe is incorrect and confusing guidance that is making institutions reticent to engage with those funds in ways that are not explicitly listed as permissible. So we're seeing a little bit of trust issues carried over on how institutions can use these funds to make some of those changes that are really important as a holdover from the prior Department of Education administration. And we really have been talking to institutions more on a one-on-one level about you can actually do this and here's the authority and here are like best practices that we think that you can institute. Not sure if that answered your question, but.
No, absolutely. And if there are folks here today who are from institutions, is there like a general place where they might be able to find these best practices? Like, is it something somewhere on the Hope Center website where it's easily accessible? And is that a resource that we could send along to folks in case we do have anyone in the audience today coming from an institution of higher education?
The Hope Center's website is full of resources. So yes, we have both a COVID guide for students, and then we have an emergency aid, equitable design and distribution of emergency aid resource, as well as obviously the reports that we've been talking about, which also include a report from early in the pandemic about how students were faring in the pandemic, and institutional resources. So I can definitely cherry pick a couple of good ones and get them to you, Lexi, to send out to this group.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I truly appreciate it. And another question is based off of course, this is the 6th year of this research, which is fantastic. How has this year compared to previous years of data? And do you have any predictions of how long these impacts from COVID might go into the future?
So this was our largest sample population from all of the surveys that we have conducted thus far. And I would say probably had the largest mix of, institutions in it. So we're glad to see the growing awareness of institutions of the need to track basic needs and security data, particularly in the absence of good federal and state and institutional mechanisms to do that with varying degrees depending on the state and the institution. So that's not a blanket statement. What I would say is the Hope Center's hope, at least, is that we can continue to provide data and research to institutions and best practices. But, and Sarah says this, frequently is we'd love to be out of a job. Like that's where we would like to go, is that the Hope Center does not have a reason to exist anymore. And we're all committed to that goal, a little bit counterintuitive, but we would love to see a day when we don't have to talk about student basic needs and security. And I like to say I do anti-poverty through a post-secondary lens because I always sit with the tension of all of the people who would consider post-secondary as an option for them if they could just meet their basic needs. So I'm personally not going to stop until we can capture all of those people that just need to have their most basic human needs met for food, shelter, safe space and things like that. And then they can actually really think about what a post-secondary education means for them or their families or their future.
Well, I'm glad that we have advocates like you hoping to put themselves out of a job. And even though I'm just starting my career, I hope I have the same things, but maybe for a couple of years later. I have still some student loans to pay off first.
Ditto.
help with that too. Anyways, so how also, and this might be the last question, just to wrap things up today, but how can universities and colleges and these institutions of higher education really make sure that they are using a racial equity lens when they're doing this work? What are some ways that we can encourage them to say, hey, we know that this is an issue. We know that racial equity is an issue. Can you please make sure that you are informing your policies with this lens in mind? What are some ways that we can apply pressure to institutions to make sure that they're actually following through on that?
I think that's a great question, and I'll answer that in two parts. One of it is tracking the data. And if let's say your emergency aid program is not capturing students that, students of color representative to the population of students of color at your institution, you're probably doing something wrong, right? There should be some equal connection between the population at your institution, the population you're serving with emergency aid. And one of the sort of theories of change of the Hope Center in terms of our policy analysis when we inform federal and state legislation is we call for tracking and data and holding people and institutions accountable for equitable outcomes. And there's also an importance of being explicit about equity and calling it out. I mean, we have 200 years of policy experience to demonstrate that, probably a little bit less than that because we have very racist historical policies 100 years ago, but we at least have a solid 50-ish some years of experience to show that policies that appear neutral on their face value are inherently producing inequitable outcomes. So that also includes having an eye on deficit-based narratives. And, one example is the earned income tax credit promotes work. This notion that we have to, nudge low-income people to work is BS. As somebody who used to be on public benefit programs, there's no way to survive on them without also pairing it with work, which is also by design. So we changed a little bit of language like that to asset-based framing where we say it supports work. So that's just one concrete example.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we are at the half hour now, and I know that in the Zoom world we live in now, everyone probably has another meeting starting in the next 60 seconds. So in the interest of making sure that folks have some time for self-care, getting water, and just thinking about the presentation today, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. But thank you so much to Carrie for your presentation. We will be sending out slides and links to everything that was mentioned today in the presentation. There will be a recording available. It will also be on the FRAC YouTube channel. So if you joined late, you will have access to it. But yes, thank you so much to Carrie again for being here and for sharing this data. And thank you to Nomi for running this webinar so that I did not have to do the technical things in the background because that stresses me out. And thank you to our participants for joining us today. And it was a pleasure to have you. And I hope that you learned something and will carry this with you into your advocacy over the next couple of weeks.
Thanks, everyone.